It's hard for me to express how delighted I am to have had this invitation from Marge. I looked upon Marge as one of those people that was way up there in college. We really didn't know each other well at all, but she was an athlete and popular and good-looking and well-dressed and all of the things that I never was. So it really was just amazing to me when she showed up at Sedona 2 years ago, I guess it was. And I never imagined that I would be here, that she would be able to do this. And when I try to describe to other people the seminars that I've done in Sedona and the one I was going to do in Santa Barbara, it's really very difficult to make people believe that it's just ordinary women with no organization behind them that have put these together. But I am so grateful to them, and I'm grateful to you for all the elaborate arrangements that I know you have had to make in order to get here. And every time I have this kind of an opportunity, it really sobers me to think that I come all the way across the country and you make all these arrangements and get yourselves here, and I'm supposed to say something that will be of some use to you. And of course I couldn't possibly do it if I were trying to do it by myself. Without Christ I can do nothing. With him, according to Scripture, I can do all things that he asks me to do. And tonight, the topic that I'd like to talk to you about is a sovereign God in a broken world. A sovereign God in a broken world. How many of you don't know how to spell sovereign? May I see the hands of those of you who have no problems? I see about 3. Those of you that have never had any problems. Those of you that don't know anybody that has problems. I don't see any hands on those. Ever suffered any disasters? Any accidents? Anything ever happened in your life that you didn't plan for? Do you have any questions about those things, such as why? We all have problems. We all suffer disasters, or somebody that we love suffers them. And if we're human, we've all asked that question, why? And many times people have said to me, well, I don't suppose you ever asked why, have you? I don't know what kind of an idea they have of what I am, but my answer is, of course I have, hundreds of times. And so did the psalmist, and so did Job, and other people in the Scriptures. I can't find anything in the Scriptures that would indicate that I'm not supposed to ask why. But I find plenty of evidence in the Scripture that I'm not going to get an answer to all of those whys. God answers our mystery with his mysteries. And what God is after is holiness. That's the end of everything that he does for us and to us and with us. And so, by way of introduction to a topic which could take shelves of books, and so we'll barely be able to scratch the surface tonight, but by way of introduction to enable you to see why it has become such an important doctrine to me, I just thought I would tell you a little bit about my story. Jan mentioned that Lars is my third husband, but she didn't mention anything about what happened to my second one, so I do need to assure you that he also died. And it's not like the poison mushroom story. You probably heard that about the man who had his third wife. His third wife had just died, and they said, well, what happened to the first one? Well, she ate poison mushrooms. Well, what happened to the second one? Well, she ate poison mushrooms. And what about the third? Well, she died of a concussion. Why not? Where did she get the concussion? Well, she wouldn't eat the poison mushrooms. And I was on a radio talk show, and a lady called in. I had been talking about marriage and submission and one thing and another, and a lady called in, and she said, what about all those husbands she had? Whatever happened to them? How come those marriages didn't work out if she knows so much about it? And nobody had explained that both husbands number 1 and 2 had died. But Lars is feeling well tonight, I think. He's feeling a little bit relieved since the 7th of September, because it was on that date that he became the front runner. I've been married longer now to Lars than I've ever been married to anybody else my whole life. But my second husband was 18 years older than I. I thought it was a miracle that I got married the first time. And when a second husband came along, to me, that was a miracle that could never happen. But God in His providence has a lot of things up His sleeve that you and I have no idea about. And so He took this woman from a little tiny town in New Hampshire of 500 people out to a small town in the northwest corner of Missouri for a speaking engagement, and it was there that I met Addison Leach, who was considerably older than I. And when he asked me to marry him, I assumed that someday, in the providence of God, in the ordinary course of human events, I would be widowed a second time, but I didn't expect it to be quite so soon. It was 3 years after we were married that we learned that he had cancer, and he died less than a year after that. But for the last month of his life, he was at home, and I was taking care of him, and I needed some help in taking care of him, and so I decided to try to find a seminary student. My husband was a professor at Gordon Conwell Seminary, and so I looked around, and I found a young man by the name of Walt, who was to move in on the following Monday, and it was that day that my husband died. So naturally, Walt assumed that he would not be needed, but as I was thinking about my future that night as I lay in bed, my daughter had left for college just a few days before. I had several empty bedrooms, and I had gotten myself all psyched up for a boarder. And so I called Walt the next morning and told him that I would be very happy to have some company if he would still like to have the room, even though I didn't need his help. And so he accepted that offer, and I called the seminary and told them that if they had anybody else looking for a room, I had another room available. And so within a short time, they sent a second man down, and those 2 men moved in and were really like angels that God had sent to me. I never would have thought of having seminary students living there if it hadn't been for my need, but they did all kinds of things for me that I never imagined lodgers would do. They were both very gracious. They would shovel snow and cut grass and wash dishes and wait on the table when I was entertaining company. They would run out and open the garage door, open the car door, carry the groceries in, put the groceries away. I really can't describe all the things that they did for me. And it wasn't very long after they moved in that I began to pray that Walt Shepard would someday be my son-in-law, because he struck me as being exactly the kind of man that I had been praying God would keep for and from my daughter Valerie. You know what I mean by from. I didn't want her to get involved before it was God's time and get married when she was too young and foolish. But I also wanted God to preserve him for her so that he wouldn't get sidetracked to somebody else. And anyway, to make a long story short, Walt Shepard is now my son-in-law, which I thought was a wonderful illustration of some of the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight and tomorrow, that life comes out of death, that God has miraculous ways of transforming our sufferings and exchanging ashes, for example, for beauty. The garment, he gives us the oil of joy for mourning, and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. But what I could never imagine in my wildest dreams was that lodger number 2 would marry me. And so that's why Lars Gren is here tonight. He was that other lodger. And I was telling Jan Webb's mother this story. Jan's father had died shortly before that, and Jan's mother is a whole lot smaller than Jan, I think. She looks about 4 feet tall to me, and I guess weighs about 75 pounds, but she's the cutest little Texan lady you ever saw in your life. And she was asking me how I'd met Lars, and so I told her this story, and she said, I believe I'm going to rent my house out to 3 widowers. Well, to go way back, years before Lars came along, I went to Ecuador in 1952 as a missionary, feeling that I was quite well prepared for missionary work. I had come from a missionary home. My parents had been missionaries for a short time. I was born in a foreign country. When we moved back to the States, my parents entertained missionaries continually. We had a guest room, even though we were relatively poor. And my mother has, to this day, a guest book with 42 different countries represented. We were not allowed to do very many things on Sunday, but one of the few things we were allowed to do was to read missionary stories. We used to go to missionary meetings and look at all those thousands of dreadful missionary slides. You know, the kind where they tell you, well, it's too bad that you can't see it in this picture, but right behind that hill was so-and-so, and the next picture, well, this guy got his head in the way, but otherwise you would have been able to see so-and-so. And pictures of people lined up in front of little churches, and then another group of people lined up in front of a few palm trees, and the missionary standing there with a grinning group of people, and the before and after, you know, the kind of slides I'm talking about. We really hated those, but we saw thousands of them. And it wasn't surprising that 5 out of the 6 of us children became missionaries. The 6th one is a professor in a Christian college and has written some Christian books. But I began to pray at a very early age as to whether or not God wanted me to be a missionary. I thought I was going to be a doctor. That was really my great dream. But I thought perhaps I would be a medical missionary. It was not until I was a junior in college that I believed that God was calling me to linguistics. And so eventually, having taken Wycliffe training, and incidentally, Jan, I was never with Wycliffe, nor were any of the 5 men, but that's all right. She just fainted up here in the front. It was a good story. I guess if a missionary does Bible translation work, people who've heard of Wycliffe assume they are Wycliffe people, but that didn't happen to be the case. I took Wycliffe training in Oklahoma and went to Bible school, and in 1952 went to Ecuador, not knowing what tribe I would be working with, but knowing that there were 9 Indian tribes in Ecuador whose languages had never been reduced to writing. And so I set about studying Spanish and praying that God would show me which tribe to go to. And there were 2 English women working in a small tribe in the western jungle of Ecuador, a tribe called the Colorados. Those of you that know Spanish know that the word simply means red, an apt name for that tribe because they painted themselves red from head to toe. They used a dye that used to be used here in the United States for the coloring of margarine. There may be a few people in this room as old as I am, and you can remember the time when margarine came in a white form, and you had to mix it up with a little package of red paste or powder, and that came from the Colorado Indians of Ecuador. It was called achiote, and they would mix that up with Vaseline in a very thick paste and smear it on their hair. The men did this. Their hair was cut more or less at eyebrow level, and they would mix it with Vaseline in such a thick way that they could bring their hair out in a visor in the front, stiff. And they would spend a half an hour smoothing it down until there wasn't a single crack anywhere, and you really would have thought that you were looking at a red steel helmet. Their hairdo was remarkable, to say the least. They painted their entire bodies red from head to toe. Then they painted black stripes horizontally from head to toe and polka dots between the black stripes. And they blackened their teeth, tongue, and lips. And of course, when I asked the obvious stupid question that anybody would ask, why in the world do you paint your teeth, tongue, and lips black? They looked at me with dismay and shock and said, well, you certainly don't want to look like an animal, do you? Animals have red lips and tongues and white teeth, and we want to be civilized. So they were a colorful sight. The men wore miniskirts made of black and white stripes, hand-woven material, and over their shoulders they would throw scarves of turquoise or yellow. So you can imagine, we lived in a clearing in the jungle, and you can imagine the scene as you'd see a Colorado Indian coming out on horseback from the green backdrop of the jungle, the red paint, the black stripes and the polka dots, the red steel helmet, the striped skirt, and the turquoise and yellow scarves flying in the wind. It was a marvelous sight. And it was their language that I was supposed to try to write down. These two English women that were working there had been there for 5 years. They had absolutely no idea how to go about learning an unwritten language. And so they heard that I was in the country, that I had had that kind of training, and they invited me to come and work with them, which I did. And I found an informant in answer to prayer, a man by the name of Macario, who was tremendously qualified, much better qualified than I had dreamed of asking God for. He was bilingual. I expected to have to work monolingually with these people, which is a very slow and laborious process. But I found Macario who could speak Spanish. And so, since I had learned that language, we were able to work bilingually. And he had grown up with Indians on La Hacienda. He was a white man, but he spoke the Colorado language perfectly. And so it was with great thanksgiving to God that we began working together. He had been out of a job. He was willing to work for me at my price, and he was a Christian and eager to serve the Lord in this way. And so we worked together very happily and very profitably for about 6 weeks, reducing this language to writing, when Macario was murdered. Now, he was literally the only man in the world that spoke those two languages. The Indians did not speak Spanish except just a few words to do their trading. There were no white people that had ever learned the language. He was shot at point-blank range in broad daylight with about 6 witnesses, very near to the clearing where we were living. And I was on my knees in my bedroom when I heard gunshots, and I was reading that passage in 1 Peter, "Think it not strange concerning the fiery trial that is to try you, as though some strange thing happened." And I ran out. I heard these gunshots. There was nothing unusual about that, but it was when I heard people screaming and yelling and running and horses galloping through the clearing that I went out to see what had happened. And Macario was dead. I had not been a missionary in the jungle for more than maybe 2 months. And it was as though God was asking me, "Do you trust me?" As I said, I had gone out thinking that I was rather well prepared. I had heard all these missionary stories. I had met many missionaries. One of them was Betty Scott Stam. And Betty Scott Stam's prayer had become a part of my life. "Lord, I give up all my own plans and purposes, all my own desires and hopes, and accept thy will for my life. I give myself, my life, my all, utterly to thee, to be thine forever. Fill me with thy Holy Spirit. Use me as thou wilt. Send me where thou wilt. Work out thy whole will in my life at any cost, now and forever." And Betty Scott Stam, with her husband, was captured by Chinese communists, marched half naked through the streets of a Chinese village. Betty was forced to watch as John knelt at the chopping block and had his head chopped off. And then Betty was also beheaded. She had been a guest in our home. I remember as a little child the headlines in the newspaper that my father brought home telling about their death. And then I copied that prayer into my Bible when I was probably about 12 years old, and I had prayed it and still pray it to this day. Work out thy whole will in my life at any cost, now and forever. And that gave me an inkling of what the cost might be. And so I went with stars in my eyes, imagining that I was going to be the apostle to the Colorados or some other tribe, whatever one God might lead me to. Things were working beautifully. I had learned Spanish. I had received an invitation from these women to go to a place where I was needed. I had the kind of training that was required to do the job. I had a good start on the job. God had answered my prayer in giving me Macario. And then suddenly this stunning blow, and Macario was dead. Well, to skip over many details, it was a few months after that Jim Elliot, who was working with the Quechua tribe over on the other side of the Andes in the eastern jungle, asked me to marry him. And he said, "I will not marry you unless you will learn Quechua first." Because he'd seen too many missionary wives who never quite got around to learning the language. So he said, "You're not going to be this missionary's wife unless you learn Quechua first." And so I accepted the proposal with that condition, feeling that it was not too high a price to pay to get a man like Jim Elliot. And I was learning Quechua in the eastern jungle when I got a letter from one of those two English women telling me that all of my language materials had been stolen. I had turned over to them everything, coaching them in the use of these materials. It was after Macadio's death that I had continued in a much slower and more desultory fashion, trying to reduce this language to writing, and I had succeeded to a degree, to the extent that I could turn it over to these women and they could proceed on the basis of what I'd done. But all of that material was in a suitcase which was stolen. Now, this was in the days before Xerox or tape recorders, and there were no copies of anything. All of the thousands of 3x5s and all of the notebooks and all the charts and everything else that goes into reducing a language to writing was in that one suitcase. Well, we prayed that God would bring that suitcase back. It would never do anybody else any good. We knew that. And we knew that God knew where it was and could get it back. And guess what? We never got it back. And so it was just as if everything that I had done in that year, God had just wiped absolutely clean off the board. And he said, "All right, you trusted me back there for Macadio's death. I didn't explain my reasons to you then. But what about now?" And so my dreams of being an apostle to the Colorados, the translator of the Colorado Bible, the one who reduced the language to writing and all that, evaporated. And again, I was looking into that strange abyss into which any of us look when things happen that we cannot explain. And I was asking those questions, why? And there were no answers. I'd love to be able to give you reasons 1 to 10 why God allowed Macadio to be murdered and why God allowed my materials to be stolen. But so far, I've never come across one except the ones that are in the Bible. Those are the ones we're going to be talking about tonight. But let's skip over the next few years. I married Jim Elliot. I had learned Quechua. We were married. We had waited for each other for 5.5 years. We had waited on God because we didn't know whether God might perhaps be asking us to remain single. It's possible that some people have to remain single for the will of God. There is work to be done that married people can't do. And Jim and I were willing for that kind of service, if that's what God was calling us to. And so we had committed our love and one another to him. There was no commitment to each other. We were not engaged or anything. Asking that if it was God's will to bring us together, that he would do that in his own time. And he did in 5.5 years. And we had been married for a little over 2 years when we got word that Nate Saint, the pilot who served our station, had discovered some inhabited Auca houses. The Aucas were those savage Stone Age Indians that had never heard the gospel. No outsider had ever gone into their tribe and come out alive. And so Jim was just exultant. He had been praying for the Aucas for years. He had been praying that God would send him to the Aucas. And so he and Nate and Ed McCulley, another missionary, participated in dropping gifts from a little plane to these Indians over a period of months. And it was in 1956 that they went in to the edge of Auca territory, set up a camp, and with 2 other men, 5 altogether, attempted to lure the Aucas over to where they were with the hope that they would get an invitation from the Aucas to go right into their very village. And as Jan has told you, all 5 of them were speared to death. And once again, God was saying, you trusted me for Macadio's death. You trusted me for the loss of your language materials. What about now? Do you really believe that I've got the whole world in my hands? And that's really the question, isn't it? When anything at all happens, for which we have no explanations, do we trust God, or do we pack up and forget about Christianity? Because there really is no middle ground. God is either God, a sovereign God who is in charge, and therefore deserves my worship, my trust, and my service, or he isn't God at all. And we who call ourselves Christians are, of all men, most miserable. We have no foundation for our faith. And so it's not primarily my experiences that I want to talk to you about tonight, but I did want you to know that I have some reason to be having to think about God's sovereignty. Primarily what I want to direct your attention to is the one who is in charge, a sovereign God in a broken world. To me, one of the most mysterious things about those crises, and I left out one other, which is minor by comparison with the loss of Jim, but before Jim and I had been in the jungle for a year, 3 major things had happened. I had lost my informant, I'd lost my language notes, and Jim had lost the station on which he had been working for a year. He had spent the first year learning the language, helping with a boys' school, rebuilding 3 dilapidated mission buildings that had gone to the cockroaches and the termites, and building 2 new ones. And all of that went down the Amazon in a flood in one night. All the buildings, the old ones and the new ones, and 500 hand-planed boards that he had collected for the next building. And listen to this, 1 hand-planed board in the jungle represented 1 full man day of labor. And there were 500 of them that went down the river. And one of the most mysterious things to me was the actual material things that were involved in my losses. There was a gun, there was a thief, there was a flood, and there were wooden spears. Now these are just things, aren't they? I can remember pondering endlessly the fact that a wooden spear, about 8 feet long, was capable of separating Jim Elliot's spirit from the body that I knew and loved so well. And when you think about your troubles, it's very easy, isn't it, to get involved in second causes. Don't get involved in second causes. Don't be mystified by the physical things, the material things, the person whose fault it happens to be in your mind, but deal with him who is in charge of all of it. Now, the God who is sovereign is the one who made the whole universe and everything in it. He's the one who made the materials and gave men the brains to make guns. He's the one who created that man and died for that man who stole that suitcase. He's the one in charge of floods and rains. He's the one who could certainly have stopped those ignorant Stone Age people from hurling those spears. Or if he hadn't stopped them from hurling the spears, he could certainly have caused the spears to miss their targets. I believe with all my heart that not one spear could have possibly hit one of those 5 men without the permission of God. Now, don't misunderstand me. God did not do that. God did not cause those people to murder Macadio. He did not cause somebody to steal a suitcase. He did not cause a flood. He did not cause the murder of 5 men. He permitted it. Even a flood, that the insurance policies call an act of God, is still one of the results of the fall, isn't it? We live in a broken world. We live in a world corrupted by sin, a world into which God told Adam and Eve death would enter if they disobeyed. And they disobeyed because they preferred to believe what Satan told them. They trusted Satan. They mistrusted God. Who would do that? Nobody but us. Think back to your own mysterious experience, that thing that happened to you or to somebody you love that you can never explain. Did Satan say to you, "Hath God said"? Do you really believe what God has said in His Word? Can you possibly believe in that kind of a God in the face of this event? Satan says things like that, and most of us believe him at some time or other. God doesn't love me. God doesn't really care what happens to me. God isn't paying attention. God is not interested in my work. He doesn't even care about the sacrifices that I've made to Him. I work my fingers to the bone for this church, and what kind of thanks do I get? What kind of thanks are you looking for? What are you expecting God to do for you? Now, I want to read to you from 2 Corinthians 12. I wouldn't go across the street to give you merely Elisabeth Elliot opinions. I certainly wouldn't come across the country, and I certainly would be embarrassed to have you bother to come to a seminar like this if that's all I had to say. Just how I feel about things. What I want you to get your teeth into during this weekend is the Word. And in 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, we have Paul telling us about a very unusual spiritual experience. It was so unusual, where he tells us about this man that was caught up into paradise and heard words that so secret that human lips couldn't even repeat them. Something that he really could have boasted about. A spiritual experience that would make other people feel very unspiritual. Do you know anybody that talks about spiritual experiences that way? So you think, oh, gee, nothing like that has ever happened to me. I guess I must not be a spiritual giant like she is. So he says here, in verse 7, 2 Corinthians 12, to keep me from being unduly elated by the magnificence of such revelations, I was given a sharp physical pain, which came as Satan's messenger to bruise me. This was to save me from being unduly elated. 3 times I begged the Lord to rid me of it, but His answer was, "My grace is all you need. Power comes to its full strength in weakness. I shall therefore prefer to find my joy and pride in the very things that are my weakness, and then the power of Christ will come and rest upon me. Hence I am well content for Christ's sake with weakness, contempt, persecution, hardship, and frustration. For when I am weak, then I am strong." There are some tremendous spiritual principles in this short passage. Paul had a spiritual experience, and he was given, he says, a sharp pain. Now, who do you think gave him the pain? Well, he says very clearly, it was Satan's messenger. But he says it was to keep me from being unduly elated. Do you think Satan cares if he gets unduly elated? I can't think of anything that would make Satan happier than for one of us to be unduly elated about some spiritual experience. So in this passage, we see the work of God and the work of Satan brought together. Both are clearly taught. Satan is at work in this world. Sin and death entered into the world, and God has given Satan permission to do all kinds of terrible things. Now, why did God give Satan that permission? Now, that's a question that neither you nor I nor the greatest theologian or philosopher is going to answer to our intellectual satisfaction this side of heaven. We do not know the depths of the mystery of evil. But we know one very important thing, which is a clue, and that is that God created us with the power to choose to do wrong. Now, why would he do that? Well, because he wanted to create us with the power to choose right. And in order to have the power to choose, you have to be able to choose between two legitimate alternatives, right and wrong, black or white, this or that. And a choice is a limitation, isn't it? And so God created the possibility of a free moral choice. And he told Adam and Eve, don't touch that fruit. Was that because God wanted to cheat them of one good thing? Something that was pleasant to the eyes, good to eat, a tree to be desired? That was the way Adam and Eve looked at it. No, it was because God knew that the burden that that tree carried was not a burden that man was created to bear. Man was not created to bear the burden of the gods, which was the knowledge of good and evil. And God, like a loving father, withheld from his child the thing that would destroy him. Any loving father is going to say no to the child who asks if he can have 6 popsicles, because the father knows what the child doesn't know, that it will destroy him. And so he says no. And the child says, you never let us do anything. You never let us have anything. And Satan came along and said that. Did God say that? Did he say you will die? You won't die. Help yourself. And so Eve believed the great lie, which was that God didn't really love them, that God was really trying to cheat them out of something good. And so she helped herself. Satan has been allowed a great deal of leeway. But God is still in charge. And so while Satan would love to have made that spiritual experience the source of sin in Paul's life, Satan loves to distort and to twist every good thing. God had given Paul a wonderful experience. And Satan would love to twist and distort that thing. And so God steps in as a sovereign God and allows Satan to give him a sharp pain in order that God's purpose may be fulfilled, which was that he should not lose the blessing of that spiritual experience by becoming inflated with pride, unduly elated. Now, that's not the only thing God had in mind. He wanted to prevent that. He also wanted to reveal his grace. And the third thing, to demonstrate his power. When we ask why God allows certain things to happen, there are lots of good answers. None of them, I suppose, are sufficient to satisfy our human curiosity, but they are sufficient to satisfy all that we need to know for life and godliness. And here are 3 good reasons as to why Paul had this thorn, or sharp physical pain. Number 1, to prevent his becoming unduly elated. Number 2, to reveal his grace, God's grace to him. And number 3, to demonstrate his power. So what does this tell you and me about our own experiences? First, that God is in control. That sharp physical pain was given for a purpose. Even though Satan was the messenger who gave the pain, God was still working out his sovereign purpose. And God is never for 1 second out of control of your life or my life or anybody else's. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. He's got the tiny little babies in his hands. He's got the whole of the universe, the galaxies, and I'm told that there are something like 200 billion galaxies, of which we live in only one. And it all works in perfect harmony. The book of Revelation tells us that in his hand, in his right hand, he held 7 stars. And John says he laid his hand on me and said, "Fear not." He's in charge. The second thing that I want you to remember from this passage is that God, when bad things happen, he is still at work. And the third, he is at work to draw us to himself. We could make that all one sentence. God is in control even when bad things happen, comma, he is at work to draw us to himself. A sovereign God in a broken world. I've often looked at an audience and thought to myself, I wonder what that person is suffering. I wonder why that woman came. I wonder what that man is thinking sitting back there. I wonder why this person on the front row is looking so angry. I wonder why that woman back there is crying. And of course, I don't know. I don't know your problems. I don't know why you came. I don't know why you're suffering right now, or what that burden that seems about to break your heart may be. And it's very fortunate that I don't, because there's no way in the world that I could talk to you if I knew all the problems. I would be totally overwhelmed. I don't know the problems, but I know the one who knows them. And I'd like you to ask yourself some questions about whatever is on your heart tonight. That difficult thing, is God doing that to you? Is that the way you've been looking at it? Why is God doing this to me? Why did God do that to Johnny Erickson? Why did God do that to Corrie ten Boom? Why did God do that to those 5 men? What kind of a God do you believe, our unbelieving friends say to us, who would allow a thing like that? How can he possibly be a loving God? How can you worship him? How can you trust him? So that's the question. Did God do it? Is God doing that to you? I want you to understand one thing for sure, and that is that God never does evil. But God permits evil. God gives permission. That thing in your life, is it the result of your own sin? There may be things which are the direct, discernible result of your own sin, and you know what they are. If you don't know, don't lie awake racking your brains to try to figure out what you've done that made you deserve that. Don't assume that God is punishing you for something that you've done. But obviously there are plenty of things that we do for which we have to suffer. That's just the way the world is set up. If you do this, God said, such and such is going to happen. If you eat this fruit, death is going to enter into the world. And ever since then, God has been giving us choices. If you refuse to do my will, there is going to be cursing. If you will do my will, there will be blessing. God took the people of Israel through the terrible wilderness in order to get that message across. I am your shepherd. I can get you through this wilderness, but I want you to trust me. I want you to obey me. And so that is a question to ask. If you're suffering, is it because you've been disobedient? Okay, if you can say no to that, then go on to this question. Is it perhaps a messenger of Satan? Maybe you don't know. But remember, whatever it is, those three principles apply. God is in control. God does allow bad things to happen. God wants to draw us to himself. Now, because I sometimes am absolutely horrified when I listen to my tapes and I realize how many words I've wasted, I've written out a couple of things here that I want to read to you just to be sure that I get across exactly what I mean in these last few minutes. All of us at some time have felt ourselves to be helpless and at the mercy of people who are out to do us in. We cry help, and help doesn't come. Has God forgotten us? Panic sets in, and we shiver and shake like captive wild animals. Our faith seems to be of no use anymore because these people have us where they want us, and prayer seems a mockery. Some of you, I'm sure, are suffering at the hands of other people. Remember when Jesus was a captive and at the mercy of the Judean procurator named Pilate? Pilate claimed that he had authority to release Jesus or to crucify him, whichever he happened to choose. Shouldn't this have intimidated Jesus? It didn't, not at all, because Jesus knew there was not a single second when he was not being held in his Father's hands. You would have no authority at all over me if it had not been granted you from above, he said to Pilate. We are always held by those same strong hands. Never mind, then, why power is granted to others to do you wrong. That is God's affair, not yours. Mind only the fact that they couldn't possibly touch you if God didn't permit it. And then trust him. He will see you through. People have asked me many times why I haven't been bitter about my husband's deaths, or if I have been bitter. And if I've said no, then they wanted to know why. And the only answer I can give you is just that very simple one, that I really did believe that God was in charge. I really believed that he loved me and that he knew what he was doing. And so I couldn't possibly resent what he was doing. Was Pilate's power sufficient to do Jesus in? It seemed to be. It was a travesty of public justice, that trial, wasn't it? But Jesus said you would have no power at all over me if it was not granted to you from above. And then one more principle that I want to be sure that I articulate the way I wanted to. Think of the cross. Spectators at the cross of Calvary imagined a dramatic escape or rescue as the proof of Jesus' kingship. God had an infinitely greater demonstration in mind. The Son would not manage to escape from the hands of his captors or from the nails and wood that held him, nor would someone else come to his rescue. He would go through the last extremity of what it means to be human, and by that very means, by death itself, destroy death. We sang that marvelous hymn tonight, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, and I was so delighted that they had put down on the sheets the old version. Some of the newer hymn books have cut out that verse that says, Death of death and hell's destruction, land me safe on Canaan's side. I think that's a marvelous name for Christ. He was the death of death. Ultimately, he will destroy death, but he couldn't have if he hadn't faced that enemy himself, and by his death destroyed it. He would become, by his obedient dying, the death of death and hell's destruction. When we, in our lesser miseries, plead for escape or rescue, what unimaginable solutions God has stored up for us. But all he says in answer to our pleadings is trust me. So think back to whatever seems to be the human or earthly cause of your troubles. Think back to that gun, that thief, that flood, those spears, in my experience, or that unjust judge, those swords and staves with which they came out after Jesus. Think of the clubs, the thorns, the wood, and the nails. They were the causes of his suffering, weren't they? At the hands of evil men. And yet, think of him who is sovereign. Don't get mixed up with the confused rollings and wheels of second causes. Think of him who is in charge. Think of that sovereign God who loves you. He loved me and gave himself for me. And if he spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, shall he not with him also freely give us all things? He is a sovereign God. He is in charge. He loves you. But you still live in a broken world. And things are going to happen. Things that you don't plan. Things for which there seems to be no human explanation, but for which there is all the explanation we need. In the 4th chapter of 2 Corinthians, we read these words. Hard pressed on every side, verse 8, we are never hemmed in. Bewildered, we are never at our wits' end. Hunted, we are never abandoned to our fate. Struck down, we are not left to die. Wherever we go, we carry death with us in our body. The death that Jesus died, that in this body also life may reveal itself. The life that Jesus lives. Through these little deaths that we die, these daily deaths, as Paul speaks of them, the life of Jesus is going to be manifest if we will allow him to transform us. Now, this is a tremendous spiritual principle, one that we can hardly touch upon, but which we're going to be referring to again tomorrow and Sunday. In the 16th verse of the same chapter, 2 Corinthians 4, he says, though our outward humanity is in decay, yet day by day we are inwardly renewed. Our troubles are slight and short-lived. Remember, Paul had had some troubles that you and I would hardly call slight. He had been in shipwrecks, in prison. He had been beaten with stripes, that is, with cattails, those cat o' nine tails, 39 times. He had been flogged in public. He had been put in stocks. He had been in hunger and nakedness and perils by the sword and perils at sea and perils in journeys. And he's the one that's talking about our troubles being slight and short-lived. And their outcome, an eternal glory which outweighs them far. That's the comparison, you see. Our troubles, if you put them on the scales, are going to go way up, and the weight of glory is going to go way down by comparison. Because he says, our eyes are fixed not on the things that are seen, but on the things that are unseen. For what is seen passes away. What is unseen is eternal. Those second causes, none of them are going to overcome the sovereignty of God. A sovereign God in a broken world. He's in control. He lets bad things happen, but he wants to draw us to himself. God bless you.